Okay, in this second video, what I want to show is creating your own exceptions. I have the same code, but I made a few minor modifications. The first, I have a double here called score count, and here's score count. It's going to be the count of scores, but I'm going to change it from an integer to a double. And the reason for this is doubles act a little stranger, meaning decimal points. You can make them 0, but what's actually stored is not always known. So I'm going to look at if score count is less than 0.00001, I'm going to basically say, oh, it's 0. And I created my own floating point division exception. Again, don't get too hung up on this. Just kind of show you how you would create your own exception. Again, as a public class floating point division exception. I inherited it from the application exception. In the book, it says exception in C#. If you're creating your own, you have to take it from the application exception. And here it is, floating point division exception. And what it accepts in its constructor is the exception type. And then I set the constructor up for the application exception. I send it to exception type. So basically, this is it. This is my floating point division exception. I created it myself. So when I go in here, if my score count, which it was an integer, now double, is less than 0.00001, I then create an exception object from the class floating point division exception. And here's the floating point division exception. And then I also say the exception type, floating point division by 0. So there's where I said in the constructor I have to give it a string. Exception type is the string that I'm giving it. And then I throw the object. Remember, when I create my own, I have to throw the object itself. It doesn't automatically do this. And then everything else goes the same, except here instead of instead of score count, I have count of scores, which would have been 0. But this is thrown before I even get to this point. And right here, I'm going to write the message. So let me put the breakpoint here. Toggle breakpoint. And let's see if we hit it. Let's first go through correctly. So how many scores will you enter? I'll enter 3. And the first one is 99. Second one is 88. Third one is 85. Up. I forgot to change the less than or equal to, so let's get rid of that. That would have given me a different error. Okay, let's start again. How many will you enter? 3. So we have 99, 88, 85. Average is 90, terminated normally. Notice this 0.00 because now it's a double, meaning it's a floating point. It's not an integer. And here's my terminated normally code that I put after. So I went through it correctly. Now I have my breakpoint here in the floating point division exception. Let's start it. I'm not going to have anything. And I hit the breakpoint. Here it is, floating point division exception. Okay. Hit the F11. And I'm going down to my finally. And so what I have is exception type, floating point division by 0, terminated normally. And if I look, if I look over here, exception type floating point division by 0. It said exactly the message I wanted to say. Exception type floating point division by 0. And then I jumped down to the finally. So again, I created my own exception. And this is if I'm using a double, which is a decimal point, having a decimal point. I created it. I called the object accept object. Here's the class. This is the class I created, and I inherited it, the exception. And then I had to throw the object. Once I threw the object, this caught it. And again, well, what kind is it? Well, it's a floating point division exception. We have a floating point division exception. Here's my object. Okay, put out the message. And that was the message I put up here, which I passed back up. So that's just creating your own, kind of give you an idea. Again, if you didn't get all the ins and outs of the code, it's not necessary. Just want to show you kind of how it works in a real program. So again, we'll talk about this on Wednesday night. Thanks for watching.